Welcome to chapter 4 of the course, which is all about retopologizing the character we sculpted so far. So just like in previous chapters, here's a quick overview on what is included. In the rest of this video, I want to tackle basic questions and principles of what the retopology is, what it needs to be, and etc. In the next video, it's all about the setup and workflow of how to create the retopology effectively. After that, I will give some deeper videos on how to think about topology, planning an optimal outcome, and tackling one of the most complicated and important areas, the face. Once all of that is done, a lot of time-lapse videos will follow from the creation of Rain. I will go over my process of retopologizing the head, body, hair, outfit, and more. In the last video, it's then about additional polishing, fixes, and optimizations I added after the bulk of the retopology is done. This includes helpful practices and important steps before going into further steps of the character creation. So now let's tackle the basics real quick. The biggest one is the question, what is retopology? The name essentially means to redo or remodel the topology, which is the structure of the mesh we have. In the previous chapter, we dipped our toes in the purpose and advantages of a cleaned up mesh. It allowed us to create more polished expression tests and cleaner base meshes. The final retopology is to create the objects that are used for rigging, animation, and ultimately the rendering of the character in the end. For this, the topology must be highly optimized for all the shapes and deformations that we need in the animation. This time, we can't reproject all the details on top like we did in chapter 3. It needs to be modeled manually in a way that all essential details are captured by the topology itself. But instead of roughly box modeling it this time, I will show a complete polymodeling approach in this chapter. But generally, what makes a good retopology? One thing is a minimal necessary resolution to support the shapes and planned deformations of the character. This doesn't just mean that the amount of faces needs to be high enough, but it also needs an optimal edge flow that supports the shapes and deformations. I'll go more in depth on this in the next video. Lastly, the objects also need to be manifold, which means basically they're supposed to be single-sided and watertight. So, for example, no two faces attached to the same edge. All edges and vertices need to be attached to a face, no overlapping geometry, etc. It's basically like, in short, every object is made of paper, no loose wires, and only one side pointing outwards. But something I said in the introduction of the overall course becomes very important now. This course is not focused on creating game characters. The topology is one of those points where the principles that you need to follow are hugely influenced by the software, rendering engine, and medium that you are using the character for. In games, the emphasis is on real-time playback. So the models are not being subdivided, and a lot of information is instead baked into textures, like normal maps, to fake details. To make sure the baking and deformations are very predictable, the geometry is usually being triangulated. This workflow is very different with its own limitations to work with. For a film, there's way more render time for more expensive resolution, displacement, and deformations, including complex effects. For more detail, we won't just bake or add some textures, but also subdivide the objects, which means the topology should be almost exclusively made of evenly sized quads to avoid stretching and pinching areas. But I hear you already asking, isn't there an auto retopology tool in Blender? And yes, there are the new quad and voxel remeshers, but they are specifically meant for sculpting workflows. No remesher at the moment can come close to a well-made manual retopology. So unless you just want to remesh a background asset that won't be deformed or seen up close, I advise against using any remeshers. Many hate retopology, but I personally actually love it. It's essentially a big puzzle of your own making. You keep trying to optimize the mesh and end up trying to solve many issues along the way, many of which you actually likely personally caused. It's a lot of problem solving, just like every other step in the character creation workflow. But if you know what is required of the character and are aware of the principles of retopologizing, then it can be a very meditating and satisfying experience. The next video is all about how to create, guide, and think about topology itself.